So now it is my absolute great pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening, Mr. Antony Green, AO. Antony, as everyone here of course knows, is best known for his role as Chief Election Analyst of the ABC. And he's worked for the ABC, in fact, since 1989, and in that time he has worked on more than 90 federal, state and territory elections. And of course he is the face of election night coverage in Australia. He's also worked on local government elections, numerous by-elections, and has covered elections in the United Kingdom, New Zealand and Canada for the ABC. And of course, he hasn't even had much sitting down time since the last federal election, given we've just had a snap state election called in Tasmania. Australia's electoral system has a level of complexity and results reporting unknown overseas. Election night, as Antony has said, is like leaping into the void with little safety equipment apart from a thin stream of data from the Australian Electoral Commission. So tonight we are privileged to hear the reflections of Antony on his 36-year career, a catalogue of the highs, the lows, the laughs and the embarrassments, the thrills and the spills of live election night broadcasting. Thank you, Antony.
I should start with my usual, more obvious jokes. People said, why do you cover elections? Why did you become an election analyst on television? It's because I didn't have the personality to do the weather. How do you get a job as an election analyst? To read the obituary columns. And this title, which was, I've always described election night as like bungee jumping for intellectuals. In the early days, when I was doing elections, you were leaping into the void, connected by a thin stream of data from the Electoral Commission. In those days, it was a thin stream. These days, you get giant files. But in those days, you had to be in the tally room to get access to that, to access to the computer system of the Electoral Commission. And as most of you will remember the old days when we did the federal elections from the Epic Centre. I think that's what it's still called in Northern Darwin. And it was always a great feature of election night, sending the floor reporter outside to interview all the people standing in the freezing cold air, waiting to get in at the next election. But look, I'll start this talk with a bit of drama, some play history, and that's Don's Party, which you can't do an election night without mentioning Don's Party. Now, of course, the play's not about election night. I mean, election night and the early indications, the Whitlam-led Labor Party could win the 1969 election, and then its slow deterioration as their hopes and dreams of the change of government disappeared was just a metaphor to get into their personal lives. So it wasn't about election night, but it's always a useful starting point for me to talk about things, because what am I doing on election night? I'm not analysing what voters have done. What you're doing on election night is the data is coming to you as a stream from the Electoral Commission. What you are doing, you are modelling how the votes are counted. The votes come in a particular order, in a particular pattern, and what you are doing is saying, all right, this is a very statistical model way of looking at it, we've got these votes at this stage, we've got X% counted, the two-party preferred is this. You use that as a statistical estimator of the final outcome. And at what point are you confident that statistical estimator is going to be close to the final result, in which case you can call a seat. And if you call a seat and you've got a probability attached to every seat, if you want to know who's won the election, you add up the probabilities. It's a very simple solution. It's very hard to get people to think in non-binary terms, though. And I remember an election in 1998 where we were using that model and we'd predicted John Howard was back. And Channel 9 was still using their party people to call seats. And there was a lot of seats in doubt. And they were saying, you've won this, that's one. You've won this, that's one for you. It's in between, we'll just call it zero. And so they couldn't get either side to win at that point, where we were confident calling. And I always remember Tim Fisher walked in a point and said, we'd been elected and stuff. And they cut back to Channel 9's panel. And Ray Martin said, Richo, Michael Kroger, Tim says they've won. You saying it's still too close to call. That's the way you do your modelling. And now everyone has moved on to this system. But I'll talk a little about how all this came about. I wasn't doing, my first election was the 1989 Queensland election. Quite an exciting night after 32 years of a coalition, then later a National Party government, followed by the federal election. I was hired on a 6-month contract to do the 1990 federal election. So I wasn't around in the days when people had to sit on camera and work out what the percentages were from looking at the tally board being shot by a camera. So we were at the point where you were no longer looking, in my early days, there were debates about should we show votes or should we show percentages. To this day, we show votes and then they quickly switch over to percentages because the votes are pretty meaningless to me, but people seem to want to look at them, so we go quickly past them. But what I said about Don's Party, and the relevance here is to how those early years of how the elections unfolded. In 1987, as I said, in 1969, when Don's Party was writing about, was that the votes came in from the cities first. In those days, there was no guarantee every country polling place had a telephone. So they either used to count the votes and then bring the results, drive into the nearest town with the numbers, which meant the country votes came in later. And so the Labor vote would start high and decline. In 1987, the Electoral Commission changed that. All schools across the country had telephones, so they decided they would phone in results so every polling place became a counting centre, which meant early on election night, the figures were looking terrible for Labor. Their vote was way down, and there were certain commentators calling victory for John Howard at that point. And then as the night came in, the Labor vote kept going up, and this was caused by confusion with this issue. Now, at that time, there was a gentleman called Dr. Ross Cunningham, who went on to be Professor of Statistics here. I think he's Professor Emeritus nowadays. And he, I think, did his PhD or master's thesis, I'm not sure, on election night forecasting. And he did all the original mathematics, which we took from him to do the ABC's election computer, and most other people now have a variant of this statistical model. And what he identified is, what I'm talking about there, those early figures come in, you've got an estimator. Well, your figures are progressive figures. They keep going up and up and up. Your sample of votes counted gets bigger and bigger. So what are the things, at what point can you be confident your results are correct? There are two things you have to account for. One of them is variance. I mean, it's like the old example of a big bag with 1,000 ping pong balls in it. Some of them are black, some of them white. How many do you have to take out before you can work out what the ratio of the two is? And if you assume it's completely random, there's a mathematical formula that tells you how many you have to take out to be within a certain confidence interval of the correct ratio. And that's what election night is. How many polling places do you get in? How many votes do you get in to the point where you can say that this percentage two-party preferred you've got at the moment will be above 50%? It's the same issue. So variance just deals with the fact there is a bit of bouncing up and down, and you have to have a certain amount before you can be confident that that variability from polling place to polling place is cancelled out in your total. But the second thing is something that is more insidious, which is statistical bias. Is that instead of an accurate estimator, which predicts in the final figure, your estimator is systematically biased away from the actual figure. And in the 1969 example, it was biased by the fact that the big city booths came in first, and so the Labor vote started high and fell away. In 1987, it was the reverse bias for the first time. The country vote came in. Ross Cunningham had done a lot of work. He worked out that if you plot the two-party preferred by percentage counted on the night, every electorate has its own specific shape of how the path that it follows. And he worked out a way to take results, to come up with a statistical model that fitted that data, and then he would use that to correct the early figures. He called it a bias-corrected method. And he used that successfully for a number of elections in the early 80s with Channel 10, and then ran into the 87 election. Of course, he couldn't use his model. Anyway, he moved on to other things after doing election night after that, but I did a lot of work with him in 1990, and he gave us a lot of assistance in the computer system that after the 1990 election, I was kept on to design a new computer system. I should say I had no background in the media. I happen to have been someone who'd done maths and computing in the 1970s at university with a science degree, went out and worked in the computer industry, decided I didn't want to do that for a living, and in 1984 went back to study politics and economics at Sydney University. And then I saw this job one day for an election researcher at the ABC, and I'm thinking, that's my job. And I was hunting around for economist jobs, trainee economist jobs at the time, and suddenly I got offered this, and I'm thinking, right, I will, yes, I can always go back to economics, and I never did, because after the 1990 election, I prepared a book of notes for that election, and I've done them at every election since, and I'm soon about to donate copies of them all in electronic form to the National Library as a collection of contemporaneous notes on every election I've worked on. I was given this task, and Ross gave us a lot of assistance on how to do this modelling. What happened in 1990 was, after 1987 in its confusion, the Australian Electoral Commission started to do what was called polling place matching. So that as they've got 6 polling places in, they would compare the primary vote in those 6 polling places to the previous election. So you had a relatively accurate set of numbers. But then we had another problem in 1990, was suddenly the primary vote for minor parties went beyond 15%. So suddenly you needed preferences counts to know. So that by the time of the 1993 election, we were giving us preference counts. So we're doing matched preference counts, a really accurate way to do the predictions. Funnily enough, in 1992, I spent a whole day in a committee room at Parliament House having an argument with the Electoral Commission and the committee about this, because the Commission, in its wisdom, and phones were a different thing in those days, they wanted to do 1 phone call per polling place, and they'd phone through the primaries and the 2 candidates preferred at the same time. And we went to the committee and said, no, you shouldn't do that, because what we'll have is the parties with the scrutineer information before the Commission's reporting it. And so we'd like to get them as separate phone calls. And after much argy-bargy, they agreed to that, which is just as well, because we couldn't do it as 1 phone call nowadays. You'd be waiting hours to get results, because the number of minor party votes and the number of candidates is making a bigger and bigger gap between those 2 counts. So that came in 1993. And I'd written this nice, designed this nice new nifty computer system which would do this polling place matching. And so from very early on in the night in 1993, we had a really accurate trend that there was a swing going to Labor. The only problem was nobody expected it, particularly on the ABC board, where David Hill was the managing director, former South Australian Labor Premier John Bannon was on the board, and Rod Cameron, the Labor Party's pollster, was on the board. They all thought Keating was going to lose. So we started the coverage, and what we hadn't thought of was, how do you represent this match data? So we draw our graphs of first preferences, and in those days, what we would then do was wipe out the other bars and grow to the 2-party preferred. Now, if you're just using simple numbers, that's easy, because of course it increases. But if you're using matched figure, and I just remember this graph for Isaacs came up, and the Liberals were on 70% primary. And I remember Jim Middleton saying, well, let's look at the preference count there, and the graph went, voomph, it just reversed. And suddenly Labor was ahead, and they just went, oh, there's something wrong with the computer, which everyone presumed was correct. And so all these arguments, no, don't use the prediction. I remember having someone come up and tug me on the shoulder and said, they said there's something wrong with the computer. I said, there's nothing wrong with the computer. And about 20 to 9, after much argy-bargy, I finally got on camera and I drew our chamber diagram and said it's a Keating Labor majority of 9. I think it was 13 in the end. And that was at 8:40, and everyone just went, oh, that's pretty amazing. It was much easier then. I mean, what it was then was a very simple model. If you had the Labor primary vote and the Liberal primary vote, and that was 80 to 85% of the vote. And if there was any swing from one to the other, it was reflected in the primary votes. The Labor Party does better in mining towns, in migrant communities, working class suburbs. The Liberal Party does better in leafy suburbs, does better, the National Party does better in country towns. And that means that, if there's a swing from one to the other, it tends to occur at the primary vote. It's not the preferences in those days that mattered. So once you had a swing going and your model was going, you had a pretty accurate prediction until the 1998 Queensland election. And in those days, everything was 2-party preferred. We just left out this situation where maybe Labor might drop to 3rd, and we just manually correct it, give it away on the night. And we got to the Queensland election in 1998, and there were Labor seats all around the state falling to 3rd, and our fall-through algorithm just said, we'll give it to whoever's got the highest primary vote. And actually, Labor was dropped, but there was a high vote for One Nation and the Nationals. And by just going on the highest primary, we suddenly had all these safe national seats being won by the Labor Party. And I was in there clobbering this result, clobbering this. It was one of the toughest nights I've ever had. So between that and the federal election, I had to sit down with a program and thinking, right, we can't use this mechanism anymore. We have to come up with a mechanism to deal with the fact that the Labor Party isn't winning a seat. You can't fall back to the primaries. So we came up with a mechanism for the 1998 election, which is just trying to adjust the system to cope with being a 2-candidate preferred contest rather than a 2-party preferred contest. Now, Ross had done work on the thing with this primary match, this matched polling place issue, is that as I said, there's a correlation between, I didn't use this, I sort of explained it. There's a correlation between booth size and two-party preferred vote. So you can draw this curve that rises with the Labor vote in any electorate with a significant rural component. But if you operate on the swing, so if you compare these 5 polling places to 5 polling places last time, you get two huge advantages. If you're talking about a mixed rural-urban electorate, you might have two-party preferreds by polling place, which go from 20% to 80%, a huge variance. If you operate on the swing, it might only be from -10 to +10. So you've got a range there of 20% rather than 60%. So you've immediately got an advantage by having a smaller variance. I'm just using range there. I'm not going to try and calculate what the variance would be. But variance is just a measure of spread. If you operate on swing, you have a smaller spread. And if a smaller spread, the thing will settle down more quickly and go to your final trend. The second thing is the two-party preferred swing wasn't correlated with booth size. We talk about uniform swing, and it's never exactly uniform, but it's still reasonably uniform, and it has a smaller variance it has no bias between the swing and the booth size. There's of course a little bit there, but again, if you operate on the swing, you remove all that early figures. So in 1993, there was great concern, we were calling it earlier. I remember doing 1996 with our new improved model with the graphs working correctly, and it was obvious by 7 o'clock that the Keating government had lost. But in those days, it was always thought early figures were rubbish. So they'd plotted all these seat profiles, and we were crossing to this seat and this seat. I remember Mark Bannerman, who was my seat producer that day, coming up and saying, "Mate, have you looked at Eden Monero?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "It's falling. It's over. I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, we need to get some seats to wear it." And I said, "They've got 2 seat profiles." And we had this, and we went to a 7 o'clock bulletin, and for 5 minutes, and while that was all on, we were chucking the scripts out and saying, "Let's do some numbers." So it was remarkable in those days how quickly you could get it. Another advantage in those days was that most of the votes were cast on the day. At the end of election night, you would have 80% of the vote counted, and that was basically every vote cast on the day. These days, you are lucky to get 45% of votes cast on the day. They are all counted on the day, but we now have this extra thing, which is they've got to count the pre-polls. Pre-polls were made ordinary votes. There are so many of them. They take time to count, requires extra staff. So you get this peculiar pattern. You get all this rush of figures and then a pause before the pre-polls start to arrive. And the other complication that comes from that is to do with matched polling places. I said there's no correlation between booth size and swing. That's been breached in recent years by these pre-poll centres because there are different patterns with pre-poll votes compared to polling day votes. So we have to adjust our predictive model to cope with the fact that these figures may change as we get towards the end of the count, where traditionally, once it's settled into a pattern, it didn't shift at the end. Well, now the curve upwards gets to about 45%, and then the pre-polls start to arrive, and you might find the graph suddenly goes and settles into a different position. So that's a bit of a complex thing. The other thing that's changed is, remember I said that there was a variance, it was one-dimensional. It was from Labor to Liberal, and if there was a two-party preferred swing, it tended to be reflected in the primary votes as well. It's become more complex. It's multi-dimensional. Sure, we have, in every electorate now, you have a pattern of the variance, of the variance of support for each party by polling place within a district, and Labor, and they still tend to be a bit connected. But you've got Greens and Teal independents, and they've got their own distribution across an electorate. And so you've got the preferences might be making up 30 to 35% of the vote, not 10 or 15 as they used to be. And it's got its own peculiar distribution. And so it's become much more complex in that sense that you've got this multicollinearity and I'm looking at Simon Jackman here nodding away, this great Bayesian statistician. I'm sure he can come up with a way to solve this problem one day, but it's just so much more complex. So it takes longer and longer to call election night. For that reason, it has become more complex. So that's the model. You still rely on the computer. In the thin stream days, it was that thin stream of data from the Electoral Commission. Nowadays, we get vast amounts of data. On election night this year, there was huge files coming to us. You need a computer to process them, though. So we had a few problems with that this year. So it was back to pen and paper and scribbling at this federal election for a while there. But anyway, you've got to go out with a bang. I'll just sort of run through some of my more memorable elections. And of course, the 1993 one was my first federal election on camera. And this wonderful fight about can we call this election or not, it's just, people said, you must have been very brave. I didn't think of brave, I was just entirely confident the model worked. It was just getting through the doubters. One of the first Queensland election I did on camera, I mean, I was working off camera and had to come on to call the election. And I said, oh, the Goss government's back. I think they've won 54 seats. This is a majority of about 9 or 13, I can't remember. But Andrew Wally just looked me in the eye and said, well, it's a brave man or a fool who calls an election this early. So I'm brave or fool? I don't know, but I thought I was a bit rough, a bit tough. And even in 1993, Andrew just peered and just went, oh, that's an early prediction, of course, when we called Keating elected. But I mean, he had Andrew Peacock on his ear all night saying, no, it's too close, too close, too close. And I remember about 10:30 that night going up to the panel and said, well, that's pretty good, wasn't it? And Peacock just looked at me and said, your computer was right from the start, wink. So there's in a sense that election is also, I remember Tony, who was on our panel, Peter Costello was downstairs with Kerry O'Brien on the two-tiered set in those days, and Tony Smith, who was his press secretary and later became Speaker of the Parliament, told me this story about being downstairs, and Peter turned up, and these are those days when men didn't use typed keyboards, you see, so Peter said, oh, I can't type. So Tony Smith stood over here and drove the keyboard for him from the computer. And Tony tells me this story about Kerry turned to him at one point and said, look, you haven't won this and this and this, you've lost this, this and this, and you can't possibly win. And Tony tells me this story, Peter just looked Kerry straight in the eye and said, that's easy for you to say, Kerry. Because the guests are never supposed to call it before the leader comes out. Which is one of those peculiar things, they'll sit there and they'll say, oh, we're waiting for postals, or wait for the pre-polls, this is, which is, I think, John McGrath, I think, yes. So that was pretty amazing. The first election I ever did on camera was 91 in New South Wales, and everyone was so convinced that Green was going to win that election, and 9 were in receivership at the time from Alan Bond running them into the ground, and I think 7 were having financial problems as well. This is the time of the recession. So they didn't do a coverage, so we had Graham Richards on our panel for the one and only time. And I called the executive producer rang me. We were going off air at 8 o'clock for an hour and coming back at 9. Ian Carroll, who originally hired me at the ABC and was a wonderful man, he rang me and said, look, we're going off air at 8. Tell Quentin Dempster he can call the government returned. So Quentin went on camera and said, well, our election analyst, Antony Green, just said that I think, great. So Ian rang me and said, you've got to go on camera and do that now. I went, oh, all right. So I sat there. Oh, yeah, I think the government's backed out. I've lost a few seats. It's not as clear a cut as everyone was expecting. And thankfully, Graham Richardson agreed with me at that point. But within an hour, it was clear that was not the result. The Grant government only just got back by 1 seat. But at the end of the night, I went over to the panel and said, oh, that's pretty amazing. And Graham Richardson just went, Anthony, I just want to shake your hands. Oh, yes, that was great. Channel 9 would pay you a fortune to get their computer right. And he did this directly in front of David Hill. And let's just say I had permanent employment from that point on. Because I was originally kept on after my 6-month contract because Kerry O'Brien and Andrew Wally and Paul Lynham all told the head of news they should keep me on. So they were my early, startling ones. 98, Queensland was the most exhausting election I've ever worked on. That was just a dramatic night as a party from nowhere suddenly outpolled the Liberals and the Nationals and broke through at a time when the Commonwealth government was trying to get the WIC bill through, and there's a whole bunch of things going on at the time. And not often written up was the federal cabinet meeting early the next week, where they decided to buckle and give in on 4 of the points of the 10-point WIC plan so to get it through the Senate and out of the way, because they just realised this was poisoning their chances of winning the next election. And within a few weeks, they announced the GST, and suddenly the whole election in 98 was about the economy. Other elections that were memorable, 1999 Victoria. Brian Costa, a political scientist, was in the tally room that night. He was doing radio, and we were watching that afternoon. It was, for AFL fans, it was Carlton versus Essendon. And Carlton, Essendon were the red-hot favourites to win the flag that year, and they lost by 1 point to Carlton, and Carlton went on to get flogged by North Melbourne the following weekend. But Brian Costa always reminds me that when the final siren went, I said, that's the last upset we get tonight. And of course, as the figures unfolded that night, we'd done some change to the way we've read the data in the days before. And these extraordinary double-digit swings were coming in from country Victoria. We had John Brumby on our panel. I said, John, can you ring your scrutineers I've got a 9% swing in Ripon. Can you check whether that's happening? He rang up, came back and said, yeah, that's right. And that night unfolded, and suddenly Jeff Kennett, the invincible Jeff Kennett, had lost his majority. He then dragged on for weeks. He was put through the agony of a by-election because one of the sitting members had died on our polling day. And they lost that by-election, then he retired. And then Labor won his seat, and they won the Deputy Premier's seat, and it went on to a series of landslides. For those who also know AFL, I like to call it the Kennett curse election. He made the famous remark about Hawthorn having Geelong's measure after the 2007 grand final, and came known in AFL as the Kennett curse. So I like to talk about it because they'd done all the hard work to reform the economy and the public finances, and just as the boom arrived, they went and lost by running a terrible election campaign. So that was pretty memorable. Next one, you don't often brag about predictions in my game, but there's one that I always am fascinated by, I'm proud of. I became very aware that the ticket voting system in the Senate was being extraordinarily rorted. And after Nick Xenophon got elected to the upper house in South Australia in '98, was it in 2002? I can't remember. But I sat down with all the ticket votes around me, and I'm thinking, I can't do this on a spreadsheet. I've got to write some software to do it. So I did. And at the 2004 election, I had it on my laptop and would occasionally download the data from the Electoral Commission. And there was a moment on the night where I turned to the panel and I said, Kerry Cabot, got some big news. The last Senate seat in Victoria is going to be run by Stephen Fielding from Family First. And he just looks at me, and Bob McMullen went, oh. And Nick Minchin went, yes. Anyway, later in the evening, I said, Barnaby Joyce is going to win a fourth seat for the coalition in Queensland, run the same software. And they went, nah, it's not going to happen. It did. He got the fourth seat. But so I was very proud of that software. And in 2007, I convinced the ABC to write an online version of it. So people could program in the tickets, you could put in some votes and see what result you got out of it. And it became like this huge, nerdy online hit. You could sort of model the election. But I remember in 2013, we predicted very early on that a gentleman called Ricky Muir of the Australian Motoring Enthusiast Party had written. Anyway, on the Tuesday after the election, I got this furious email from a professor of medicine at a university somewhere saying, has Green taken leave of his senses? I've looked at those figures. How can this gentleman win from half? This is a ludicrous suggestion and the ABC should apologise. And I sent him a note back, sent him the page link, said scroll down the page and all the workings there. I didn't get a response. But and then I got involved in the whole process of getting that system reformed, and I don't think we're getting much fairer Senate results out of that these days. At my farewell last week, I mentioned that someone who I work with described me as doing data journalism before the word had even been invented, which I was doing, and I was doing a lot of blogging and work and writing and publications on this field of election analysis. Of course, there's election analysts everywhere nowadays. The access to the data is amazing these days. When we started, you had to be in the tally room to get that thin stream of data. From 2007 onwards, a gigantic file with results by polling place was available. So there's people from the Tally Room blog and Poll Bludger blog, Kevin Bonham, a whole series of people are able to take the... some of them take the data and do interesting things with it. Others just read other people's blogs and then comment on it. But there's plenty of commentary out there and a lot more awareness of all these tools, which I suppose I feel quite proud that I was in there working on this. And there's others like John Ryden and Malcolm McCarris who advocated the use of two-party preferred in an era when people talked first preferences all the time. So on the back of that, and I'm of course on the back of Ross Cunningham, who did all that original statistical work. Since then, what were some of the more remarkable elections? 2007 was remarkable as one of the tally rooms. They restructured the tally room after that because we agreed to do Benelong every half hour. Maxine McHugh versus John Howard. And every time we brought the graphic up and Maxine was ahead, the crowd would erupt behind us. The previous election when Channel 7 were trying to fly a blimp into our set, thanks to Roy and HG. But someone in the room knows what I'm talking about there. But the next election in 2010, they moved the crowd up to the front near the tally board and moved the print media to the back. And the atmosphere disappeared. That was one of the most extraordinary election nights because it was so close. And it was very clear by Monday what the result was, but it still took 2 weeks of negotiation for government. And that was the last tally room. They began negotiations for 2013, and originally Julie Gillard announced at the start of the year the date was going to be the 7th of September. And Ed Killerstein, the Electoral Commissioner, wrote to all the media outlets and said, do you want to come to the tally room? And 9 and 7 both had first week of the football finals that weekend. And it was only single channels in those days. And they didn't want, so they weren't going to come if it was the 7th of September. So Ed took the note. And so anyway, Kevin Rudd came back and changed the date to the 14th. And before anybody could say, yes, we'd like to come, Ed put out the press release saying, no, nobody wants to come, so we're going to abandon the tally room. And that was the end of the tally room, which was the press release by fiddling a few dates. And people used to think it was a bit of magic, but it was only magic because the television was there and the mood and the atmosphere. And as I always said, one day, you know, when the tally rooms, when the media moves out and the lights are turned off, a little bit of magic goes out of Australian elections, and it did. And all our elections since then have been in the tally room, except for in Tasmania, where been in studio, except for Tasmania. It has become more complex. There's more candidates. The preference flows are more difficult. You don't know who are going to be the final two. We're counting for weeks afterwards, trying to work out. We're doing 3 CPs, trying to figure out who to do the final two. I pity the poor Electoral Commission who've got to do all this in programming. But it's quite remarkable. It's also a bit different. I mean, in those days, we were all on one panel, and it'd be me and Steve Smith and Arthur Sinodinos and Kerry O'Brien. And Kerry said, well, how do you think it's all going? Steve thinks, oh, yeah, we've won. What do you reckon, Antony? I reckon, yeah. So we decided we'd call it at that point. And calling would be, like, I think we can be pretty clear here. When we bring up a chamber, fill it in, would say how many seats. No, it doesn't work like that anymore. They want to call. And as I said, these things happen. You can sit and you know where the result's going. You can see where the prediction's going. But I'm afraid the media works in binary terms. It's like, oh, we don't know who's winning. We don't know who's winning. We don't know who's winning. Then you have the call, yes, so-and-so's won. So you let the balloons go and bring in the elephants and paint the studio the colour of the winner. It's become the bane of my life, you know. If I say, I say, oh, look, I mean, at this moment, it's really tracking towards Labor being re-elected. And someone will come on and say, are you calling it? I said, no, I'm just saying Labor's on track to win. But you need to be more precise if you're calling it. I said, I'm not calling, I'm just saying they're more likely to win. I mean, I had this wonderful discussion after that with a regional journalist after the WA election. And she said, tell us about the result in Murray-Wellington. I said, well, look, the formal distribution of preferences is currently underway. By this evening, the Electoral Commission will declare the winner, but it's pretty clear at this stage that Labor's on track to lose the seat and the Liberals will be the winner. The next question was, so are you calling it? And I'm saying, no, I just said the Liberals are on track to win the seat. I mean, why do I have to put it in past tense? Which is what's happened in these recent years. It's a bit of a switch like that. We've all borrowed that from the Americans. The Americanization of our election coverage does rather annoy me a little bit. And there's look, I've made a career out of the fact that Australia has an incredibly complex electoral system and an incredible amount of data thrown at us. I mean, trying to do things like a calculator for the Senate. I remember someone who used to do Senate stuff on their blog, and one day says, oh my God, the ABC's sort of ruined my blog by actually publishing a calculator, which was true. It was an unusual thing for a media outlet to do that, and I'm still rather proud of that. And I still carry around the giant New South Wales ballot paper from 1999 as a warning of why you get rid of ticket votes, and Glenn Drury still curses me. But no, that was fun. A couple of other elections, Northern Territory 2001. Who ever thought the Country Liberal Party would fall? And the next morning, they'd arranged for me to go on The Insiders in its first year, and the executive producer rang me up excitedly that night and said, we definitely want you on now. I thought so, yeah. And so I went on, and I remember Barry Cassidy sort of asked, how significant is this? And I said, on the scale of from 1 to the fall of the Berlin Wall or the release of Nelson Mandela, it's not that significant, but the fall of the CLP in the Northern Territory are pretty much high there on the wow scale. And then he moved on to Claire Martin was the next interview. And Claire Martin, forever and a day, says, you put me in the same sentence as Nelson Mandela. And the first time she did, I thought, what are you talking about? And then I remembered what it said, so yeah. So that was pretty memorable. 2010 was just such a remarkable night. The 2019 election was remarkable because this was not going according to script. And I remember just sort of saying, about 7:30, I said, this is the 51.5 we saw in Newspoll this morning, but the opposite way round. And everyone was getting that same hint at about that point. And the 2022 election, which was just a nightmare. I mean, The teal seats, we had no history to compare them with. It was so complex early on, you couldn't see how the Labor Party was going to get a majority, and then WA rolled in. A couple of referendums. I remember doing the 99 referendum. That was the first one we did in studio with a big wall. And nowadays, I mean, God, the technology that is just remarkable when you stand there. And this federal election, I spent 2 hours in studio to do. I mean, you get think this is people who've worked in television know this. I have to wear the same shirt and tie the night before as I'm going to wear on the night. And this year I thought, stuff them. I wore the same tie, but I did have a different shirt, but nobody spotted. It was a different shade of blue. Who knows, you know? Oh, that was my last bloody election. They're going to sack me. No. Look, what other? Defeated Campbell Newman in Queensland in 2015. That's a particular physical one I remember because I did a shoulder reconstruction over the Christmas and they called the election early and I still couldn't lift my right arm above here. So they had to, we built it in because we'd had warning, so we reversed the screen so I could operate it left-handed. But I hadn't slept for weeks. It was a pretty miserable experience and trying to sort of get everyone to calm down. You know, Craig Emerson told me afterwards that we got to about 7:15. We had Labor on 45 out of 89 seats, like on the cusp of government. Channel 9 had Labor on 2 seats at that stage. And Craig Emerson was going on Sky News, and Sky News was still saying Labor's going to be defeated here, blah, blah, blah. And he'd seen our coverage, and he went on and he said, well, I'm going to be brave here. Labor's going to end up with more seats than the coalition, the LNP, and they might even win majority government. And they just went, oh, and he said, he congratulated me after, he said, I used your numbers. So, look, there's a lot more, look, I think I've entertained you enough and given you a bit of history and background, and I'm happy to answer questions, and thank you all for listening. Thank you for turning up on a cold night in Canberra winter, but then all winter nights are cold in Canberra, I suppose, but thank you very much for attending, and thank you. Is this on?
Yeah. We're good. Thank you again, Antony. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. It really is freezing, even by Canberra standards. Don't appreciate the little insult about our beautiful city. Some of these questions are clearly from my students, and I can tell, but I'm going to start with one that I don't think is. Antony, I noticed that you got a tribute from every living former Prime Minister, bar one. Do you and Paul Keating have secret beef that we don't know about?
Paul Keating sent a very nice letter. He wouldn't go on camera. He sent a nice letter. But as my boss said when he was reading it out, he spent this long paragraph talking about his victory in 1993, and he was pleased that his come-from-behind victory had made a career for me. So
yes.
It was about him.
Yes, there is a bit of beef, is what I'm taking. Are you going to write a book?
Oh, I keep getting asked that. I mean, I couldn't be bothered with a memoir. I don't think I'm good for an after doing a speech. I'm not sure you can turn that into a book. I have had 2 thoughts. One was, remember that little book, A Mirror of the Nation's Mind?
No.
Which was, like, Marion would know it, which was done years back in the 70s and 80s. And it was like talking how wonderful preferential voting and Hare Clark was. I've thought of doing a more modern version of that. Farrell and McAllister did the Australian electoral system, which is much more academic. I think there's a good point for something like that. My other thought was to something like The Origin of the Species, on the origins of the Australian electoral system. So on the origin of ticket voting, on the origin of preferential voting, because you read books on electoral systems, they always sort of build a model of a proportional system or a preferential system, single-member electorates. And when you go and look at it, covering the British referendum on preferential voting in 2011, one of the things that keeps coming up, and it's something that's not stressed enough, it's also important that the system be simple and people know what their vote is doing, what they're doing with their vote. The famous modified DONT system, which came up in the ACT in the early years of self-government, was notorious for you couldn't figure out where your vote would end up. So I think, but I do like this idea of explaining how we get where we are based on, it's a contingent fact of history, it's evolutionary theory that produces the electoral system. Nobody starts, except for the New Zealanders of all people, have ever started with a model and stuck to it. So I mean, I've occasionally thought of things like that. I'm not sure they're big sellers though. I'm not.
I'd read it. Here's a technical question, because I'm interested in this as well. How do you model uncertainty in the outcome as a function of the percentage remaining to be counted? So you said a little bit about the variance. The variance gets smaller.
As the percentage of the vote is counted, the sample size gets bigger. So, even if the figure doesn't change, it sticks there at 51, 51, 51. If you go from 40 to 60%, the chances of the remaining vote altering that number diminish. So we do it based on the percentage of the vote counted. The count always ends up at about 90. So you operate on what's gone in the past. You could do the other thing, which sometimes is useful, which is to calculate the reverse, estimate what the final turnout is, and then estimate what percentage of the vote you need now to turn that around. But you don't have to do that. In the end, the model the model works well like that. Occasionally, a good example is Kooyong at the 2022 election. We had no history to compare the two candidates preferred to, so you just had to go on the raw numbers. But what we did do was use the Liberal vote, primary vote. We could model the Liberal primary vote the same way. And our view was that if it wasn't getting above 45%, they weren't going to win. So that was the rough model, but we called that manually. And what I will always say, and I have this argument with Casey, who sort of works with me on all the elections, because whenever he sees a prediction he doesn't like, he wants to override it and push it back into doubt. And the problem is, once you override the result, it doesn't update to tell you it's got new figures, that it's got a new prediction. You have to go and look at it all the time. I prefer to let the model fix itself. It will fix itself. Another update will come in. At a federal election, it fixes itself pretty quickly because you've got a lot more sample points. Some of the state elections can be a real nuisance. Simon will remember this, Churchlands at the WA election. Liberal. And then came the pre-poll and a preference count. And suddenly it looked like Labor was going to hold it. And they've got a smaller number of polling places. So the variability, you don't remove the variability early enough with only got a small number of polling places. But look, in the end, on election night, we get a feed from the Electoral Commission, which has got primary and two candidates preferred for every district by polling place, but they come in at different times, the two counts. And then within our computer system, until we get a preference count, we've got an estimate, but we have an estimate after the preference count. And for various reasons, we've got more than one estimate. So what we have floating around is 3 to 4 different models, and our computer automatically decision makes between them. And every time a new update comes in, a new update comes in every 2 minutes, it recalculates all that. If you try and do that manually, you'll be behind. So that's why we use a computer model to do that. And one of the great things, I've had a terrible problem since the federal election, because late at night, I suddenly got asked to do a run of the teal seats. And Goldstein came up, and our model was giving it away. And I said something like, well, that's probably right, and then moved on. That's about all the thought I gave to it. I read for days afterwards that I'd called the victory on the night. And because I'd done that, Zoe Daniel called her victory. And it's like, any candidate should have their own figures. And to me, that was such a passing thing. I've got no memory of doing it at all. But people keep saying, oh, you called it. Well, on election night, there is nothing I call. Every one of them is automated. Every seat call is automated. And I think most of the other networks work that way to some extent if they've got a computer system. Some of them just trawl everybody else's websites and put the numbers into the auto queue. No.
The team on election night is remarkably unflappable. The one time I've seen them a little bit flapped was when the data feed ran out this time, and I got a very urgent text from Casey. And when we saw David Pocock's quota at about, I reckon, 9 p.m. this election night, that got I think we call it election nerds chat. That got the group chat very excited.
The Pocock got 40% of the vote. Oh, well, there's something. The results in the ACT make you think, what's the future for the Liberal Party in the ACT? It just shriveled the federal election.
Well, they gave up on it.
Yeah, they have, and Eden Monaro is not even close. So what do they advertise for? This is the footprint for advertising in the area. That's a bit harsh. There's always going to be what's the alternative to equivalent of the Liberal Party? It's gone through several name changes through Australian history, but there's always room for a non-Labor party. I know some in the Liberal Party hate academics. We all tend to talk about Labor and non-Labor. if you ever do history, that's an important thing, because otherwise you get tied in knots, you know. This is the first time that, you know, I say it's the biggest Liberal win since such and such, and then, you know, he said, since 1922, and people say, oh, the Liberal Party didn't exist in 1922, and you go, oh, yeah.
It's they're historians. Frank Bongiorno's here, isn't he? He's gonna drag us off stage. I think this is a great question. How much trust do you think the public has placed in the data as opposed to in you personally? And how do you think that will affect your successes?
The first time I was ever on camera for the ABC was March 1991, and the New South Wales had had a major state redistribution that cut the size of the parliament by 10 to undo a Labor gerrymander at the previous election. And it was difficult to work out what the implications were. And so I went on camera with Quentin Dempster on the 7:30 report talking about how these boundaries, they weren't much different from the draft, so I could be relatively confident what I was saying. But I'd never been on camera before, and I was like... And they gave me a pointer to point at a map, which was stuck on a wall. And so I was going... And the director came down from upstairs and said, if you lean the pointer on the map, it won't shake. It's my first tip in television. Of course, now it's all on green screens, and I never do green screen. I don't know what they're putting behind you on a green screen, so I do things live. But on the Monday, I bumped into one of the heads of news who said, mate, I saw you on television on Friday night. I said, oh, I was so nervous. He said, yeah, we could see you were nervous, but you knew what you were talking about, and the audience knew you knew what you were talking about. So that's the confidence I've always had, is that people think, you know, they have this belief that I know what I'm talking about. I'm not just crapping on like I am here. No. A lot of, you see it all the time in television interviews now for politicians. They've all had media training, and they know how to deflect a question and do this and do that. And I tend not to do that. I have a habit of answering the question. I'm not trying to avoid a question. And if I really don't know, I tend to look like I don't know, and I tend to say I don't know. If you're really not sure and you think it's unclear, it's always best to be ambiguous. But the media, television, doesn't work in doubt and uncertainty. It works in confidence and certainty. And that's what I was saying about, you know, when I say Labor's on track for victory. No, we want you to call it. You know.
It's a remarkable intersection, though, of something that is so uncertain. And I think a lot of viewers don't understand how model-based the predictions are. And yes, there is a truckload of data coming through when it does come through, but the work that you do on top of that adds so much value. It's
fun. It's like bungee jumping, like Jules. It is. You are sat there and someone is chucking data at you. Can you make sense of it? That's what I'm doing on election night. Someone is chucking data at us. Can I put it through a computer system, and can I make it make sense? You know, the details of the layering of the database structure, which is built around, we don't do it very often nowadays because you're much more doubtful. We seem to get a lot more close predictions. We don't use the predictive tool as much as we used to. I know the last New South Wales election, it over-predicted, so it's another reason why we don't do it. But it's built in to say, at the very top you get, here's the filled-in chamber, Labor majority or coalition majority of X. The layer of database to add up from polling place data to candidates to electorates, by party to party categories to contestants to overall X majority is a remarkable bit of logic and database design, and people don't really understand how complex that is to add all those probabilities up, to have the whole thing done in time.
I'm a bit of a heathen for saying this, but you also have a remarkable gut feel for these seats and for knowing when something's a bit off, which will be really missed. All the data aside, and the modelling is outstanding, and the presentation of the predictions is outstanding, but your gut feel is...
It's spotting that something's wrong. The ASSA tends to be pretty accurate with the data that comes to us. Some of the state commissions can be a little ropier sometimes. The classic to me was the South Australian election about 15 years ago, and when you go to enter in a polling place, there's a data entry clerk somewhere, there's a set of headphones, someone's reading the numbers to them. So they've got to go to such and such electorate, they open the electorate, and then they select a polling place and type in the result for that polling place. But this particular election, if you have a drop-down menu, you should have it blank. If it's blank, you can't enter the wrong figures. If there is a first polling place displayed, someone just goes, oh, and they just type it in. And so the wrong result is put against the polling place. And we had a South Australian election, and we had about 5 or 6 electorates where they put them in for the wrong polling place. I remember Bragg, which is an ultra-safe Liberal seat, and the only Labor voting booth in the electorate came in, and it was put against the safest Liberal polling place. And you had this whacking 30% swing on the first figures. And of course, we had the sitting member on the panel that night saying, oh, that's rubbish. So you get things like that. And I was trying to explain Hare Clark. I remember one of my earliest elections in Tasmania and watching Michael Field come in, because he still had the tally room, it was done at Rest Point. And Michael Field came in and he'd sacked huge numbers of public servants as a minority Labor government. And he came into that room. I have never heard a crowd that hostile in a tally room. I think every public servant that had been sacked was there. and there's little Michael Field. And I remember Nick Greiner once told him, said, you're the bravest premier in this country, you know. Come in as a minority government and do that. And that was an extraordinary result to watch that. At the next election in '96, just a little anecdote, was again we're in the tally room, but we couldn't get in to use the pavilion till the next day, till midnight that night, because Manpower Australia were performing. And the green rooms are upstairs, and our computers were all in the runway from the tally rooms from the dressing rooms to the stage. So all the manpowers would come down dressed as cowboys or something or other, go on stage and come running back with their jock strings through the... That's one of the more peculiar... I think the next election was Slim Dusty kept us up that night. But that's one of the reasons tally rooms have disappeared. One, there were terrible places to work. The 2010 federal election, it was freezing. It was August or something or other, and we were out in this shed, and you're trying to work on this complex data setup. Nowadays, we can sit in an office with a desk and big screens, and we can actually log in remotely. Tally rooms are very romantic, but looking back, they were terrible working places. Really were.
All right, final question. What's next?
A holiday. Look, I've retired. I'm not going to be presenting elections anymore. Someone maybe entice me to do the odd radio interview or something or other occasionally. I am staying on for the ABC for another year. I have to document a whole bunch of things to do with the computer systems, how you build the database to do an election night for Casey or some... they'll probably... I always had this joke that when I retire, they'll hire 3 people to replace me. Because not only do I do the computer setup and the website and do the presenting. Casey is a very good television journalist. He does a lot more television. He's taken all the television load off me, thank God. The perils of 24-hour news channels are you've got to keep going on camera and saying the same thing over and over again. Well, I don't have to be on camera, and I choose to be on as little as possible. So, for people, they want someone to do that, and Casey will do a lot more of that television stuff that I really used to hate doing. But that means who's doing the website, who's doing the data setup. And there's a lot of work to be done on how that's all going to be organised. But apart from that, I'll do a lot more bike riding. I'm going to keep my blog going and do obscure stuff, bits and pieces. I hope to be able to turn election results into documents that tally stuff. There's a whole bunch of stuff on the history of preferences I want to sort out and organise. I can go back to a project I was working on 20 years ago where I dug up all New South Wales election results back to 1856, which is a wonderful archive because there are no published returns in those days. You had to find when the election was held and when the nominations were held. And in those days, the nominations were done live on hustings. So people would get up and give a speech. So if you can find the date of the hustings, you'd know that it'd be a long 2 or 3 page, 6-point type report, verbatim report of the debate in the Sydney Morning Herald the next day. And you could sit there on the microfilm and you could find out the names of the candidates. Once you had the candidates, you then found the date when the result was reported. And the Government Gazette listed all the various dates. And people like, some of those great people involved in the writing of the origin of the party system, Loveday and Martin, who did all that, they did it with a card index. No wonder they could never produce a set of results. I could go into the Government Gazette, get the dates, put them in a database, sort them into a date table, and then go to the microfiche and saying, I want this date, this date, this date. And then I could write them all down, put them in a database, print them off, and I could check it. That's where things have changed, that there are actually databases of that sort of way. I've built that. I hope to work on that again with more annotations to the database. That'll keep me occupied.
Yes. We're not going to thank you yet, Antony. I want to introduce Professor Andrea Carson, who is the chair of the Australian Political Studies Association, to thank you on behalf of all political scientists in the country.
Thank you, Jill. I'm just going to say a few words before I pass over a token of our appreciation. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight to thank Antony Green, not only for his fascinating insights, and thank you, Jill, for also helping to bring those out about what it has been to be an ABC election analyst of the last 40 years. But I also wanted to speak on behalf of the Australian Political Studies Association to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank Antony for his enormous contribution to Australian political studies in this country. As Jill said, my name's Andrea Carson and I'm a Professor of Political Communications at La Trobe University and Chair of the Australian Political Studies Association. I have also had the privilege of seeing Antony at work over the past 2 decades in my former working life as a journalist at the ABC and at The Age, and in my later years in my academic role. And Antony is absolutely spot on when he says he was a pioneer of data journalism, something that has started to catch on, but he was very much one of the first in this country. But of course, most of you have seen him in his natural habitat. On the TV, in front of a touch screen, the sleeves rolled up, eyes scanning the results, Antony has always seemed to be at least 2 steps ahead on the day, and that is because of his very, very deep knowledge. And I want to repeat that because we've heard about some of it, but it really shouldn't be underestimated. His understanding of local candidate matchups, his understanding of electoral demographics, his understanding of historical quirks, but also his passion for this, the enthusiasm and his infectious laugh. These are the things that make him a fantastic election analyst. But Antony's work has never just been about numbers, it's been about clarity, about trust, about making political processes like redistributions, preferences, double dissolutions, understandable for every Australian watching at home. And let's be honest, he's probably taught more people about how elections work than many academics in the classroom, excluding this theatre, of course. As Australia's most famous sesvologist, it is little wonder then that he has been described as a national treasure, recognised with an honorary doctorate and honorary professorship from the University of Sydney, and his name features in political popular culture such as Casey Benito's Keating, the musical that burst into life at the Melbourne International Comedy Festival in 2005. But moreover, he's been a long-standing friend of ASSA, both as a member of ASSA and a guest speaker of ASSA. His contribution to our field is multifaceted. He's an educator, he's a sense maker, he's a translator of electoral politics and democratic infrastructure. He's equally capable, as you've seen tonight, of engaging with academics, politicians, policymakers, and the public alike. Whether that be through his presentation at highly specialist forums such as the Election Regulation Research Network or through his election blog with the ABC, he is a trusted source of information. How many times have you, like me, wanted to better understand some sort of political phenomenon and you've ended up on his blog page? There you find all sorts of fascinating insights. For example, why in 2013 the Liberals in Victoria lost their 3rd Senate seat to Australian Motoring Enthusiast Party candidate Ricky Muir. I don't know if you can remember what the percentage was, Antony. I've got it here. That's right. So for those of you who need a memory jot, this was the Gippsland candidate who was exposed in a roo-poo fight captured on home video, thanks to our inquiring press. As a consequence, I also remember too, and Antony did touch on it, how influential he was in reforming the Senate ticket system so the likes of the preference whisperer, Glenn Jury, sorry I've said that name, right, could no longer so easily manipulate preference flows that enabled candidates to enter the Senate with very, very few primary votes. Antony's expertise has had significant influence on election regulation and public policy. His expertise led to the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters recommending Senate electoral law changes in 2016 to return power to voters, to allow optional preferential voting below the line. Through his television appearances, blog posts and coverage of, we heard, more than 90 federal, state, territory elections, not to mention those overseas, he has become the face of election night coverage in Australia. And he represents something that we as academics in this room all aspire to do well, and that is to translate complexity to general audiences. It's not every day you get to formally celebrate someone who's been a constant fixture in our national story, someone who for decades has helped Australians understand the very heart of our democracy. His interest in having a connection to academia has been invaluable to Australian political science. And as he steps away from the spotlight and into the archives, it sounds like, and presumably away from tracking those swings in his sleep, we say thank you. Thank you for the late nights, the accuracy, the patience, and the decades of service. Antony, you've helped make Australian democracy more accessible. Your legacy is not just in election numbers, but in public trust of them. Please join me in thanking Antony Green.
Just a little aside, you were talking about obscure things, that they were trying to figure out how to save the Northern Territory second seat a couple of years back. And I came up with this idea of using the harmonic mean. I remember sitting down at a parliamentary committee explaining why the harmonic mean brought you closer to the constitutional requirement of proportional representation. And I thought I'd completely lost them. But then to hear Simon Birmingham as the minister get up and say, I want to thank Mr. Antony Green for coming up with a concept of the harmonic mean to save the second seat in the Northern Territory and ensure the ACT gets their third seat. So there are moments when something really obscure can come along and you can use it. And I think, yeah, that was one of the funniest things I've ever listened to, actually. Everyone thought it was another contrivance, but it worked. Thanks very much. Thanks so much, everyone.